Imagine you're a crow. You're doing what crows do best, watching the world from above, stealing the occasional French fry, memorizing faces, and keeping a healthy distance from the strange, towering creatures called humans. Then, in a single terrifying moment, everything changes. A loop of plastic tightens around your leg. Every attempt to escape only makes it worse. Flying becomes painful. Walking feels awkward. What began as an ordinary day slowly turns into a fight for survival. And then the last creature you would ever trust walks toward you. A human kneels down. Instead of chasing you away or trying to capture you, it carefully removes the plastic wrapped around your leg. A few tense seconds later, you're free. What happens inside your mind? Do you simply fly away because the pain is gone? Or do you recognize that another living creature just helped you? Can a wild animal understand the difference between harm and kindness, or is every interaction with humans just another instinctive response written by evolution? It sounds like a simple question, but it leads into one of the most fascinating mysteries in animal cognition. Because if wild animals can recognize helping behavior, even in creatures as different from them as humans, then the mental lives of animals are far richer than we once imagined. For much of modern history, scientists believed the opposite. Animals were often viewed as biological machines, creatures that reacted to the world but never truly interpreted it. Every behavior had to be explained using the simplest possible mechanism, leaving little room for concepts like intention, empathy, or understanding. That cautious approach transformed animal research, but it also created a blind spot. Over the past few decades, an extraordinary body of evidence has begun to emerge, revealing that many wild animals don't just react to what we do, they pay attention to why we do it. And the discoveries are forcing scientists to rethink one of the oldest assumptions ever made about the animal mind. That assumption didn't appear because early scientists disliked animals. It emerged because they were trying to protect science from one of its greatest dangers, seeing ourselves everywhere. Humans have a remarkable tendency to project our own thoughts and emotions onto other creatures. A dog lowers its head after chewing the couch, and we say it feels guilty. A cat ignores us, and we joke that it's being spiteful. The problem is that appearances can be deceiving, and good science demands evidence rather than intuition. To keep those assumptions in check, the British psychologist Lloyd Morgan introduced a principle that would shape animal research for generations. Known as Morgan's canon, it argued that animal behavior should never be explained by a complex mental process if a simpler explanation could account for the same action. If a bird opened a puzzle box, researchers shouldn't immediately conclude it had reasoned through the problem. Perhaps it had simply stumbled onto the correct movement through trial and error. The rule encouraged caution, and for a time, that caution was exactly what the young science of animal behavior needed. But over the following decades, caution slowly hardened into something more restrictive. Rather than asking what animals might understand, many researchers assumed they understood very little at all. Behaviors that hinted at planning, cooperation, or emotional complexity were often dismissed before they were seriously investigated. Animals became viewed less as thinking individuals and more as sophisticated biological machines, organisms responding automatically to stimuli with no need to invoke concepts like intention, memory, or social judgment. The irony is that the scientific method eventually challenged its own assumptions. As new technologies allowed researchers to observe wild animals for years instead of days, a different picture began to emerge. Long-term field studies, carefully controlled experiments, and decades of accumulated evidence revealed abilities that were becoming increasingly difficult to explain away. Birds remembered individual human faces for years. Dolphins coordinated hunts with remarkable flexibility. Primates recognized fairness and cooperation. Elephants mourned their dead. Again and again, animals behaved in ways that suggested they weren't merely reacting to the world, they were interpreting it. That realization changed the question entirely. The mystery was no longer whether animals possess intelligence. The evidence had made that increasingly difficult to deny. The real challenge became understanding what kind of intelligence they possess. Because before we can ask whether a wild animal recognizes an act of kindness, we first have to understand something even more fundamental. How does an animal read the mind of another living creature at all? The more scientists observed animals in the wild, the more difficult it became to maintain the idea that they were simply reacting to whatever happened around them. Again and again, researchers encountered behaviors that pointed towards something much richer. Many species weren't just responding to actions, they appeared to be evaluating intentions. In other words, they weren't only asking what happened, they were also, in their own way, asking why did it happen? One of the clearest examples comes from wild dolphins. In 2013, off the coast of Hawaii, a bottlenose dolphin approached a group of divers carrying a serious problem. A fishing hook had become lodged in its pectoral fin, and a length of fishing line wrapped tightly around its body was restricting its movement. An injured wild animal would normally avoid humans at all costs. Yet this dolphin did the opposite. It swam directly toward one particular diver and remained close enough for him to examine the injury. As he carefully worked to remove the tangled line, something remarkable happened. Whenever he struggled to reach a section of the fishing gear, the dolphin rotated its body, exposing the trapped area more clearly. It wasn't thrashing in panic. It wasn't randomly changing position. Its movements consistently made the rescue easier. Of course, we can't climb inside the dolphin's mind and know exactly what it was thinking. Science doesn't allow us to make claims we can't test, but the behavior itself is difficult to ignore. The dolphin recognized that it couldn't solve the problem alone, identified another individual as potentially capable of helping, and adjusted its own behavior to cooperate with that effort. That isn't simply reacting to physical contact. It suggests an ability to evaluate another creature's intentions. Humans do this constantly. We read facial expressions, body posture, eye contact, and movement to predict what someone is about to do. We usually don't even realize we're doing it. Walk into a crowded room and, within seconds, you've unconsciously decided who seems friendly, who seems angry, and who seems safe to approach. Many highly social animals appear to possess a simpler version of that same ability. Scientists call it social cognition, the capacity to gather information about other individuals and use it to guide future decisions. It doesn't necessarily mean animals think exactly as humans do or possess our form of self-awareness. Instead, it means evolution has equipped them with mental tools for interpreting social behavior. Because surviving in a complex group depends on understanding what others are likely to do next. Consider elephants. A herd functions almost like a large extended family, where individuals cooperate to raise calves, defend one another, and coordinate movements across enormous landscapes. Success depends on recognizing fear, confidence, aggression, comfort, and distress in other members of the group. Wolves rely on similar skills. Every hunt requires individuals to anticipate their packmates' movements, adjust their own behavior, and maintain cooperation without spoken language. Primates spend countless hours navigating friendships, rivalries, alliances, and shifting social hierarchies. Their daily lives are built around reading one another. When evolution repeatedly rewards animals for understanding the intentions of their own species, it creates a surprisingly flexible mental toolkit. That toolkit isn't designed specifically for recognizing humans. It's designed for recognizing social patterns. Slow movements instead of aggressive ones. Gentle approaches instead of attacks. Assistance instead of competition. The brain doesn't necessarily care who is sending the signal. It cares about what the signal predicts. One elegant experiment with capuchin monkeys illustrates just how sophisticated this ability can become. Researchers allowed the monkeys to watch two humans interacting with another individual. One person behaved helpfully, assisting the stranger in reaching a goal. The other deliberately interfered, making the task more difficult. The monkeys themselves weren't involved. They simply observed. Later, both humans offered the monkeys food. Again and again, the monkeys accepted food from the helpful person while rejecting it from the one they had seen behaving selfishly. Even more striking, the helpful or unhelpful behavior hadn't been directed toward the monkeys at all. They were evaluating how someone treated a completely different individual and using that information to decide whom they trusted. That changes the conversation entirely. If an animal can judge another individual's behavior toward a third party, then recognizing helpful intent isn't some extraordinary ability reserved for rare rescue stories. It's a natural extension of the social intelligence many species evolved millions of years before humans ever appeared. And once you realize animals are constantly reading intentions, another question becomes impossible to ignore. If they can remember those intentions, how long do they remember the individuals behind them? After all, recognizing that someone helped you is useful for a few seconds. Remembering who helped you months or even years later, is something else entirely. Few animals illustrate this better than crows. For centuries, people treated crows as little more than noisy scavengers. They're common enough that it's easy to overlook them, but hidden beneath those glossy black feathers is one of the most sophisticated social minds outside our own species. Researchers have shown that crows can recognize individual human faces with remarkable accuracy, and unlike many animals, they don't quickly forget them. One famous series of experiments revealed just how extraordinary this ability is. Scientists wore distinctive masks while temporarily capturing and releasing wild crows for research. Years later, simply putting those masks back on was enough to provoke an immediate reaction. The birds recognized the faces associated with a negative experience and began sounding alarm calls. But the most surprising part came next. Many of the crows joining these noisy confrontations had never been trapped themselves. They had only learned about the dangerous human by observing or interacting with other crows. The information had spread through the local population. In a sense, crows were sharing reputations. Calling it gossip may sound playful, but it captures the basic idea remarkably well. One crow discovers that a particular individual represents danger, communicates that information through vocalizations and social behavior, and soon other crows begin responding the same way. Knowledge becomes communal rather than individual. A single encounter can influence an entire neighborhood of birds. Of course, reputations aren't built only on bad experiences. Around the world, people who consistently feed wild crows have reported something equally intriguing. After weeks or months of regular interaction, some birds begin leaving behind small objects, buttons, colorful stones, bits of polished metal, even tiny pieces of jewelry, in the places where food is usually offered. These items have little practical value to the crow, yet they appear repeatedly in what many researchers interpret as a form of reciprocal exchange. It's important not to romanticize this behavior. We can't say a crow experiences gratitude in the same emotional language humans do. But we also can't dismiss what the behavior accomplishes. The bird remembers a reliable individual, maintains a positive relationship, and invests in that relationship through repeated interaction. Functionally, that's an incredibly sophisticated social strategy. From an evolutionary perspective, it makes perfect sense. In any social world, remembering who poses a threat and who provides opportunities can mean the difference between survival and death. Animals that accurately track the reputations of others avoid unnecessary risks while strengthening beneficial relationships. Natural selection strongly favors that ability because every correct judgment improves the odds of living long enough to reproduce. Once you begin looking at animal behavior through that lens, acts of kindness stop appearing as isolated events. They become pieces of information stored inside an animal's social map of the world. The real mystery, however, isn't whether those memories exist. It's whether, during a rescue itself, the animal consciously recognizes that help is being offered, or whether we're sometimes mistaking something far more instinctive for understanding. As compelling as these stories are, this is the point where science asks us to slow down. It's tempting to watch a rescued animal remain still and immediately conclude that it understands what's happening, that it knows it's being helped. But behavior alone can be deceptive, and the most experienced wildlife researchers are often the first to remind us of that. When an animal is trapped, injured, or cornered, its body enters an extreme survival state. Stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol flood the bloodstream, preparing it to fight or flee. Yet, there's a third response that receives far less attention: freezing completely. Biologists call this tonic immobility, an ancient defense mechanism found across many groups of animals. At first glance, tonic immobility can look surprisingly similar to trust. A bird may stop struggling in someone's hands. A rabbit may lie perfectly still. A reptile may become almost motionless. To an observer, it can appear as though the animal has accepted help. In reality, it may be doing nothing of the sort. The nervous system has simply shifted into a last resort survival strategy. Remaining still can sometimes increase the chances of escaping later, or reduce further injury during an encounter with what the animal believes is a predator. In these moments, stillness tells us very little about what the animal actually understands. This distinction is something wildlife rehabilitators learn through years of experience. They spend thousands of hours caring for injured birds, mammals, and reptiles. And over time, they begin noticing subtle differences between an animal that is merely frozen and one that has genuinely become calmer. The change isn't dramatic, it appears in small details. Breathing becomes slower and more regular. Muscles gradually lose their rigid tension. The eyes begin tracking the environment instead of staring fixedly ahead. Some animals even adjust their posture voluntarily, making treatment easier rather than simply enduring it. These aren't definitive proof of trust, but they suggest the nervous system has moved beyond pure panic. Many rehabilitators describe another fascinating pattern. After days or weeks of consistent, predictable care, certain animals begin reacting differently to the people who have treated them. A bird may turn toward a familiar caretaker's footsteps but remain wary of strangers. A fox may stay noticeably calmer when approached by the same individual each day. The animal hasn't become tame, nor has it forgotten that humans can be dangerous. Instead, it has updated its expectations based on repeated experience. That distinction matters because it reminds us that understanding isn't an all-or-nothing phenomenon. Animals don't need to think like humans to recognize patterns of safety. At the same time, we must resist the urge to interpret every quiet moment as gratitude or every lingering glance as affection. The evidence is strongest when we remain cautious, allowing behavior to speak for itself. And once we separate genuine social recognition from instinctive survival responses, the most extraordinary rescue stories become even more remarkable, because they begin to stand out as something far beyond simple fear. Once we account for stress, instinct, and the limits of what animal behavior can tell us, a handful of encounters remain remarkably difficult to dismiss. These are the cases that continue to fascinate biologists, not because they prove animals experience gratitude in the human sense, but because they reveal a level of behavioral sophistication that demands explanation. One of the most famous occurred in 2011 off the coast of California. A humpback whale had become hopelessly entangled in thick crab fishing lines, the ropes wrapped tightly around its mouth, pectoral fins, and massive body, cutting deeper with every movement. Exhausted from struggling, the 50-ton animal drifted near the surface as a team of divers entered the water. The rescue lasted more than an hour. Working carefully with specialized knives, the divers swam around an animal large enough to overturn a boat with a single powerful movement. Yet throughout the operation, the whale remained astonishingly calm. It didn't thrash, it didn't attempt to flee. As each section of rope was removed, it subtly adjusted its position, giving the rescuers access to the remaining lines. Then came the moment that made the story famous. After the final rope was cut, the whale could have disappeared into the open ocean. Instead, witnesses reported that it slowly circled back. One by one, it approached the individual divers, passing close enough that several described gentle physical contact. Others recalled the whale lingering nearby, its enormous eyes seemingly fixed on the people who had just freed it. Marine biologists are careful when discussing this event. Perhaps the whale was simply orienting itself after hours of restricted movement. Perhaps it was investigating unfamiliar objects in the water. Those are entirely reasonable explanations. But what makes the encounter scientifically remarkable is that the whale didn't behave randomly. It repeatedly directed its attention toward the specific individuals involved in its rescue. Whether that reflects curiosity, recognition, or something even more complex remains an open question, but it is precisely that uncertainty that makes the case worthy of serious study. Whales aren't the only species that challenge our assumptions. Elephants provide another compelling example. Living in tightly bonded family groups, they depend on cooperation throughout their lives. Researchers have documented elephants helping injured herd members, lifting calves from mud with their trunks, and supporting weakened companions so they can continue walking. Their social lives require an extraordinary sensitivity to the needs of others. Occasionally, that sensitivity appears to extend beyond their own species. Wildlife rangers have reported wild elephants slowing near injured humans rather than charging past them, while other observations describe elephants covering the bodies of deceased people with branches and vegetation, the same behavior they sometimes display toward members of their own herd. These accounts are still being studied, and scientists remain appropriately cautious about interpreting motivation. Yet, the consistency of such observations has led researchers to investigate the possibility of cross-species empathy, the capacity to respond to the distress of an entirely different kind of animal. That possibility is profoundly important. It suggests that the mental machinery evolution built for cooperation within a species may sometimes be flexible enough to cross the species barrier itself. If that is true, then a rescue is more than a physical interaction. It becomes a meeting between two social minds, each trying to interpret the intentions of the other. And that raises perhaps the biggest question of all. Why would evolution ever produce a brain capable of recognizing kindness from a creature it was never meant to understand? The answer, surprisingly, may have very little to do with humans at all. Long before our ancestors ever encountered a crow, a dolphin, or an elephant, evolution had already been solving a different problem. Life in a social group is incredibly demanding. Every day, animals must decide who can be trusted, who is likely to compete, who needs help, and who represents a threat. Making the wrong judgment can cost an individual food, status, or its life. Over millions of years, natural selection favored animals that became skilled at reading behavior rather than simply reacting to it. A relaxed posture, slow movements, gentle physical contact, and predictable actions often signaled cooperation. Sudden movements, direct aggression, or erratic behavior usually predicted danger. Individuals that could recognize those patterns made better decisions and survived long enough to pass those abilities to the next generation. What's remarkable is that these social signals aren't unique to one species. The details differ, but the underlying patterns are surprisingly universal. Calm movement is less threatening than frantic movement. Careful approach is different from pursuit. Assistance looks different from attack. Evolution didn't create a brain specifically designed to understand humans. It created brains capable of interpreting social intentions wherever they appeared. That's why a dolphin doesn't need to know what a scuba diver is. A crow doesn't need to understand human civilization. An elephant doesn't need to comprehend our language. They only need to recognize behaviors that, throughout evolutionary history, have consistently predicted either safety or danger. In that sense, kindness isn't a uniquely human language. It's a pattern of behavior that social animals have been learning to recognize for millions of years. And that brings us back to the question we began with. When a wild animal remains calm during a rescue, remembers a familiar face, or changes its behavior after being helped, it may not be thinking, "This human is kind," in the way we would express it. But it may be reaching a conclusion that is functionally just as meaningful. This individual is not a threat and may even be worth trusting. That simple realization doesn't just change how we understand animals, it changes how we understand ourselves and our place within the larger social fabric of life on Earth. Think back to that crow from the beginning. A single piece of plastic trapped around its leg. A frightened animal with every evolutionary reason to fear the strange, upright primate reaching toward it. And yet, if that encounter changes how the crow responds to humans in the future, then something extraordinary has happened. One small act has become part of that bird's understanding of the world. What's even more remarkable is that for many social species, those experiences don't remain with a single individual. Crows teach other crows which faces to avoid. Young elephants learn by watching older members of the herd. Wolves, dolphins, and primates constantly observe one another, building their own picture of who can be trusted and who cannot. Every interaction becomes another piece of information flowing through social networks that humans rarely notice but that have existed for millions of years. That doesn't mean every rescued animal understands our intentions in the same way we do. Some never will. Others may simply be responding to patterns their brains evolved to recognize long before humans existed. But perhaps that's the most fascinating discovery of all. The ability to detect kindness may not belong to one species. It may be an ancient survival strategy shared across many forms of life. In the end, evolution's greatest achievement may not be intelligence alone. Intelligence can solve problems, invent tools, and reshape the world. But the ability to recognize when another living being means you no harm, to see cooperation where there could have been conflict, may be an even deeper adaptation. And somewhere above you, on a telephone wire or the branch of a quiet tree, a crow is still watching, remembering, and deciding what kind of creature a human really is.